Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to the housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at the email I will be putting into the chat box. And now I would like to introduce our presenter for today. Lenny Hayes is a enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton of the northeast corner of South Dakota. He is also the owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. He has extensive training in mental and chemical health issues that impact Two-Spirit and LGBTQ communities. Lenny has also worked with the Native American community, which includes the American Indian Family Center, the Shakopee Sioux community, and was a consultant and therapist with the Little Earth of the United Tribes, Minneapolis. He is currently in private practice specializing in Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ issues with adults and youth, and he most recently was selected to be a technical assistant and consultant with the Office for Victims of Crime. His experience and training has made him a sought-after workshop partner on Native American historical and intergenerational trauma and how it impacts the Native American community as well as Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ individual and community. And I will now turn it over to him.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Hanovi, for your introduction. Today I'm going to be presenting on a silent epidemic, sexual violence against men and boys. So who am I? We always ask that question in Native community when we do an introduction of ourselves. Again, my name is Tikawanahi Luta, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes. I am a citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I'm founder and owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. I'm a mental and chemical health therapist specializing in marriage family therapy. I'm an educator. I'm an advocate. I'm a motivational speaker. I am also a wink, which is a word that was given to me by my people. I am a Dakota Sioux member. I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse and adult rape. And I'm also a survivor of child mental and physical abuse. And I'm also a survivor of the foster care system. So one of the things that I'd like to remind all the participants, because we are going to be talking about a really hard topic. Some of you may experience some emotions or some feelings, and I really want to encourage everyone to take care of themselves. If you need to step away, please do, because again, like I said, this is a really heavy, heavy topic, but it's a topic that we don't talk about. So to start out, one of the things that I like to ask people is, how many of you know of a male, both boy or an adult, who has been impacted by sexual violence? If so, what were some of your struggles and challenges? How did you respond? So many times when I do this presentation in a public forum, one of the things that I know that people struggle with is the fact that they do know a lot of males who have been impacted by sexual violence, both boy and adult. But one of the things that a lot of people really struggle with is how to respond to individuals who've been impacted. Now, one of the things that I usually remind people in order to break down stigma about this issue is that, yes, I do identify as a two-spirit male, but the violence that I experienced as a child and as an adult does not define who I am as a two-spirit male. I was born a two-spirit male. And so as part of that, when I talk about breaking down the stigma, I remind people that my sexual orientation doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I was impacted by sexual violence, but that I'm a male who was impacted by sexual violence. So one of the things that I like to ask individuals, so I'm not sure if a lot of you are familiar with this picture, but this is a picture of the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that we talk about, especially when we talk about LGBTQ issues, is that statistics say today that 1 out of 10 individuals who identify, that 1 out of 10 individuals usually defines themselves as an LGBTQ person. But one of the things that I talk about in this picture is that how many of those males in this picture do you think have been impacted by sexual violence? Sexual violence against boys specifically has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, but again, we don't talk about this topic specifically because I believe that, people are, really uncomfortable about talking about this. And so, which also prevents a lot of our male survivors from coming forward to seek healing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to specifically just talk about what is sexual violence. So sexual violence is when a person uses tricks, power, threats, or violence to have sexual contact with another adult. Often we call that rape or sexual assault. When an individual is a victim of a relative, people often use the phrase incest. When a child is a victim of an adult, we often call that child molestation. So what is sexual abuse? So sexual abuse is sexual contact without consent. So one of the things that often we don't really say or talk about is that children do not consent because they often do what adults tell them to do. So here are some many different types of sexual abuse. An adult sexually touching a child can either be male or female. Having the child touch the adult sexually, male or female. Photographing the child for sexual purposes, sexualized talk, showing the child pornographic material or making them available is a form of sexual abuse. Exposing genitals to the child, masturbation or otherwise being sexual in front of the child, voyeurism, verbal and emotional abuse of sexual nature, engaging a child in prostitution, and witnessing others being sexually abused. Now, one of the things that I talk about as being a survivor of child sexual abuse, I didn't know until I went on a healing journey that I experienced a lot of what the different types of sexual abuse are, but also the fact that I came from a very dysfunctional home and often would see things that a child shouldn't see. So one of the things I talk about is that in my dysfunctional home, there was a lot of alcohol use. And so there was multiple times that parties would often go on in my home. And I and my other siblings would actually see men or see a man taking advantage of my biological mother when she was passed out and would be having sex with her. So today we would call that rape. But also as a child experiencing that's a type of sexual abuse. One of the things that I also talk about too is that, coming from a very dysfunctional home where there was all different types of violence, other different types of issues that impacted me, one of the things that I had a very difficult time working through when I was on my healing journey was coming to accept that my own biological mother sexually abused me also. What she would often do with me when she would get angry with me is that she would often flick my penis, or she would also bite my butt cheeks. When I had talked through this through therapy or in therapy, my own therapist said to me, you know, Lenny, that's a form of sexual abuse. And I said, no, it's not. And it took me a really long time, maybe I would say like 9 months before I was able to have like a deeper conversation about that impact on me. And one of the things that I remind people too is that I made a choice not to have a relationship with my biological mother because of the abuse that she caused on me, but it was by choice. So when I talk about all of the experiences that I had in the multiple different types of violence that I experienced as a child, I do these things not to lash out at her, but the reality of the fact that a lot of our males have a difficult time talking about this. In my experience in going across the country talking about this topic, one specific place that I was at was in New Mexico. And one of the things that I talk about is that I had 4 males that approached me. All of them disclosed that they were sexually abused as children. One of them went as far as telling me that he was sexually abused by his mother for 15 years. One of the things that I remember about the conversations with these adult males was the fact that all of them had a sense of relief on their face that someone like me was talking about it. Another experience that I also like to talk about is when I did a training in North Dakota for a board, and the husband actually attended with his wife. And one of the things that was brought to my attention by him was he asked the question, how do you go out, for me, how do I go out into the community knowing that there was a spiritual person in the community that was my perpetrator? He discussed the anger that went to his throat, and, you know, he had tears that were brought to his eyes. And one of the things, you know, that I remember of that certain moment was the fact that I couldn't just stop and do therapy with him because I was actually doing a training. So one of the things that I said to him was, I believe you. Second, I actually said to him, I'm thankful and grateful that you didn't act on your anger. And lastly, what I said to him was that I hope that he could find someone safe that he could have this conversation with that could help him heal from what he experienced. So I like to share those stories because of the fact that we know that this is a undiscussed epidemic. It's silent. We know, again, I'm going to be sharing some statistics in the upcoming slides to show that this type of violence that occurs happens within our Native community. One of the things that I also let people know is that, yes, we know that sexual violence happens in all communities in regards to males, but I'm specifically talking about what's happening in Native communities. So in this slide, I always like to let people know that boys are more reluctant to disclose than girls. Children who are victims of a family perpetrator often delay disclosure longer than a non-family member. So in my previous conversation, or what I discussed, it took me many years to even talk about the violence that occurred with my own mother. So that's a really fine example of how children who are victims of a family perpetrator often delay disclosure. So that's an example. A child is affected by sexual abuse when he may question his ability to defend himself, or may not trust his body to function in times of crisis. He may question his body and say, what did I do to invite this? He may begin to hate his body. He may begin to not respect his body or the surroundings around him. Often will begin to use alcohol, drugs, or over or undereat, and often will begin smoking as a teen. The child is affected by sexual abuse when he disassociates as a child due to memories or reminders of abuse. Even after abuse stops, the child may feel he is ineffective, powerless, and worthless. He has learned from being abused that what he does, wants, feels, or thinks makes no difference. He will continue to question himself, why did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? And why did I tell someone? So for me, one of the things that I discussed about this slide is that I do remember many times disassociating from the many types of violence that I experienced. And so I know that it's true. But also, one of the things that I also discussed is that when I came from a home where there was many different types of violence that was occurring, I didn't have a specific person to tell. I didn't have like a specific person to trust and let that person know what was happening with me. I was in the home from the age of 10 up to the age of 10. At the age of 10, I was removed and put in foster care until the age of 17. And at the age of 17, I was emancipated by the court system and was basically pushed out and was told, you're an adult, figure it out. The sexual abuse that I experienced, I can remember as far back as it's starting at the age of 5. So the same time that my mother was also perpetrating violence, I was also being sexually abused by a stepbrother who was 18 years old. The other experience that I remember was also being sexually abused by different relatives in the home. But one of the things that I really want to express and really let people know is that I don't want people to, it's not my job, and it's not what I want. I don't want people to feel sorry for me in what I experienced as a child, but the fact that healing is possible. I went through 10 years of extensive therapy to heal from all of the trauma that I experienced. But one of the things that I want to say to people is that healing is possible. When a boy is sexually abused by a woman, he faces confusion and isolation when he is sexually abused by a woman. A boy who talks about being abused by a woman is often greeted by disbelief, denial, trivializing and romancing his story, faced with society's perception that he may try to fit in, and he begins to brag or joke about it. I've heard many stories of this happening with males who have been impacted by sexual violence. And if any of the experience felt good, he was not abused. If he did not enjoy it, he must be gay. So those are some of the things that a lot of the heterosexual males experience in regards to being survivors of sexual abuse. So what are some of the pieces of childhood does that sexually abused child lose? So here are just a few. We know that there's more of it, but I'm touching on some of the ones that are very, very important, like loss of memory of childhood. One of the things that I tell people when I present, even on this topic or any of the violence that I experience, is that I have very limited good memories of my childhood. And that's due to a lot of the violence that I went through. One of the things that I remind people is that our brain is just an amazing organ. So the brain, we know when an individual is impacted by repeated violence or different types of violence at the same time, often we lose memory. I remember when I was going through therapy, my siblings would say, well, do you remember when this happened? And often a lot of times I didn't remember it. So I would get really frustrated. And when I would go into therapy, I would ask, I would say to my therapist, why can't I remember these things? And it took me a long time to really understand. And even after being educated, then I had a really good understanding that my brain was actually protecting me, which is not a bad thing. But it also makes me sad because I can't remember a lot of the good memories. So what memories that I have that are good are the memories that I hold on to in regards to my childhood. Lots of opportunity to play. One of the things that as a Native person who grew up in a dysfunctional home, um, I didn't have the opportunity to be a child. I was too busy taking care of either my siblings or even adults that were around me. So I didn't get a chance to be a child. So one of the things that, as part of my work and working with Native people, and also in my own experience of my own healing, is the fact that I have a really strong understanding of the theory of healing the child within. Um, One of the things that I know of today is that often my little boy will come out and play. If I find myself acting like a child, I allow myself to act like a child because, again, I'm nurturing that little boy that didn't get to be nurtured. Lots of opportunity to learn is uh, one of the pieces that I've lost as a child, and also um, maybe the experience of somebody else who's been impacted with sexual abuse. Loss of control of one's body, loss of normal, loving, nurturing environment. Um, One of the things that I talk about is that until I didn't experience healing, I didn't know what a healthy relationship was. I didn't know. I was more, what's the word that I want to use? I would recognize more of the violent behavior that was impacted towards me rather than someone who was nurturing me in a good way or treating me in a good way. So these are a lot of the losses that a child experiences, both male and female. So sort of think about like what happens to a child who's been sexually abused. So, did you know that the losses that boys and men experience in their early years leave lifelong scars and pain? Boys who do not fit the traditional macho image are marginalized, ostracized, harassed, and physically punished. Bullying results in trauma. Um, the trauma that males experience is lethal, large, and hard to work through. It is possible. That's one of the things that I really, really want people to remember about this is the fact that, healing is possible. Um, Many men who have hurt others may have been hurt themselves. Because often often ask that question in our tribal communities. Well, we need our men to step forward. We need our men to protect us. We need our men to be warriors. But one of the things that I talk about is that we haven't even created a space for healing for men. So that's something to think about. So now I'm going to go into adult males, the impact of child sexual abuse. So the only research that's been done specifically on Native populations was from NIJ. You can click on the link and you will see the full report. So, so with that report, it states that 1 in 4 American and Alaskan Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. More than 1 in 10 have experienced sexual violence with penetration. So overall, they're saying that more than 475,000 American, Indian, and Alaskan Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. Now, one of the things that I like to say about that is that I believe that those statistics are much more higher because we have to think about the men who are silenced or that's preventing them to coming forward to disclose. Um, so again, I believe that those statistics are much more higher. And again, if you want to click on that link, you can see the full report. But this is the only report that was ever done nationally in regards to sexual violence against men. And so from that report, what I did was I took down some of the statistics so you can see the difference between the impact of American Indian and Alaska Native male versus non-Hispanic and white-only men. So men have experienced any lifetime violence at 81.6%. The sexual violence that they experienced was 27.5. So if you notice on your left side with American Indian and Alaskan Native men who have experienced many, many different types of violence, it's much more higher than the non-Hispanic and white-only category. So again, as part of this research, in the past year when this research was done, 39.8% of men experienced violence. 14 in the last year, 14.4% of the men experienced sexual violence. So you can see like the really huge difference in, again, the difference, with Native men versus non-Native men in the violence that they experience. So I like to show these to sort of give people an understanding about how sexual violence is impacted on Native men, in the fact, again, bringing light to that this topic is something that we don't talk about. So why do men wait to seek professional help? So we know that there's many, many different reasons why. The abuse could still be too fresh. Often, men who have not been through their own healing, to them, what they experience is too fresh. I mean, I'll give you a good example of, of when I told a story of the man who was impacted by sexual violence as a child by a spiritual leader in the community. So for him, his abuse was too fresh because he had trouble talking about it. so so for him, it's too fresh. It may not yet been defined as abuse. Often we may say to individuals, well, you experienced some form of abuse. If that person hasn't come to that space to say that they were abused, they have not yet even figured that out. So, I always say allow a person to say when and how they want to discuss their own sexual abuse. The perpetrator may still got you. You keep silent. So again, that goes back to the story of the male who was perpetrated on by a spiritual leader in the community. Fear, even though the abuse may be over, it can still feel dangerous. Even a dead perpetrator's presence can be felt strongly. Now, I've also heard stories of that situation too. The time and place may not be right to disclose. The individual may not know he has options. Feelings of being weak, battered, and hopeless to take action, self-blame, shame. So when we talk about the feelings of being weak, again, that goes back to what I talked about earlier, is like breaking down the stigma. The stigma out there is the fact that we, as a society, as a community, we only believe that individuals who identify as gay or two-spirit have been impacted by sexual abuse. Now, many times I've heard individuals say, when talking about a male who identifies And knowing that individual was sexually abused, I've heard people say, oh, that's why he's gay, when we know that's not true. You're born this way. So again, we need to start having more conversations about how can we break down these barriers to create a safe and healing space for males impacted by sexual violence. So men who are violent are often sent the message as a child: be strong, be sexually active, be straight, be independent, don't ask for help, don't cry and show vulnerability, take control, be dominant. Now, when I've been in a place of doing an in-person training, it's interesting when there's been male participants of this training who often would state that they experienced almost every one of these statements. So again, is that society who's teaching us those things, or is it coming from our own families? Something to think about. So there's many of them. Here are frequent issues and problems faced by adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Anxiety. I know that a lot of men have experienced anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, shame and guilt, inability to trust themselves or others, fear of feelings. I need to be in control of my feelings and behaviors, or their own. So compulsive caretaking, nightmares and flashbacks, insomnia, amnesia, violence or fear of violence, discomfort with being touched, compulsive sexual activity, sexual dysfunction. So when I talk about these slides, this certain specific slide that I'm presenting right now, one of the things that I give different types of situations that I was put in as an example of the experience that I've had with sexual violence. So one of the things that I talk about that has really impacted me in my relationship with my partner, I've been with my partner for 9 years, almost 10 years that we've been together. But in the beginning of our relationship, I would struggle with him touching me. And often what I would often do is I would push his hand away, not even realizing that I was doing that, until he said to me, why are you doing that to me? And so, again, for me, even though I'm a mental health provider, I still go and do check-ins periodically because it's important for me that when I have reminders of my own experience of violence, I have to do a check-in and talk about what's going on. So I always encourage people, even providers, it's okay to go in and do check-ins. Often, sometimes, again, we even struggle with the mental health stigma. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I do it all the time. Here are some more frequent issues. Extreme startle response, which, can be caused by PTSD. I definitely experienced that. One of the things I talk about too, with all of the different types of violence that I experienced, when I go into a restaurant, I am much more comfortable having my back against the wall because, again, I feel like I'm in control. I can watch what's going on around me. I'm very uncomfortable if I'm not given that opportunity to sit against the wall. And I still experience that, and I will be honest about that. But I do have the coping skills, again, of the reminders of the different types of violence that I experienced. Social isolation, alienation, feeling isolated or alone, inability to sustain intimacy in relationships, or often what I did was I entered abusive relationships because that's all I knew. Because I had not yet experienced my journey of healing, overachievement, that can definitely be a issue, especially with somebody who For me, like I like to talk about, currently right now I hold 3 master's degrees, and I sort of think about, was that part of the abuse that I um, experienced, that I had to overachieve. Um, I don't question that now, but I often think, I wonder if that was part of it. Um, as adults, becoming abusers and or protectors. One of the things that I talk about is the fact that I have never perpetrated sexually on anyone, but I perpetrated in different ways. One experience that I talk about is, I love to read books. I love to drink coffee. So you will see me spending a lot of times in bookstores and coffee shops. And one experience was, I was walking through a bookstore, and this book jumped out at me. And the title of the book was The Verbally Abusive Relationship. I opened up the book and I looked at the characteristics, and I thought, oh my God, I'm doing those things to my partner. Um, and so again, I went into therapy and did a check-in, because even though I didn't perpetrate in a sexual way, I was perpetrating, being verbally abusive to my partner. Alcohol, drug abuse. I do not define myself as an alcoholic, but I define myself as a person who abused alcohol. I don't have a program. I'm currently I've been sober now for 7 years by choice, only because I went back into ceremony, and I knew that if I was going to do this type of work, and also the fact that I was going to be helping the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community, I knew that I wouldn't be a good example if I was hanging in the clubs with friends, so I do not drink. Sex addiction. One of the things that I talk about that is, growing up on a reservation and not having access to online, or not really having access to any of the gay clubs here in Minneapolis. So when um, I moved here 22 years ago with 23 years ago actually, moved here with a lot of unresolved trauma. And so one of the things that I discovered was that you can get online and hook up with men. And during that time, in the beginning, before my healing, I found myself hooking up with 3 to 5 men a day. And it wasn't about the sex, it was wanting to be loved, because I remembered many times thinking to myself, well, maybe the male that was coming to my home, maybe he would like me enough and want to be with me. So a lot of times it wasn't about the sex, it was about wanting to be loved. Compulsive behaviors. I can tell you my compulsive behaviors was in shopping. Um, Also, too, one of the things I experienced was I couldn't stand to even have a cup or a dirty cup on the counter or on a stand in the living room. Everything had to be at a place where I felt it needed to be and was okay with. So today I am definitely not like that. I'm kind of sort of those one individuals that really takes a lot of time to even clean my own home, just because I'm so busy, so I don't freak out about that. Unrealistic negative body image, um, feelings, feeling like a frightened child. So these are a lot of the issues that impacts adult males who have been impacted by sexual violence. But one of the things that I really want to stress is that what I've showed you does not mean that every male who's been impacted by sexual abuse has these issues. So I really want people to understand that and know that. Some of the most common mental health disorders that adult males experience is dysthymia, a chronic depressed mood, major depression, which is severe, then dysthymia, post-traumatic stress disorder from what they experience, and anxiety. Anxiety can be a huge issue of individuals who've been impacted by sexual violence. So it's important to know that not all issues and problems are the same with all adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Each individual is different with similarities. So it's really important to remember that. Again, I stress that to everybody because one of the things that we often do is that we will often put labels on people, and we shouldn't do that. Excuse me, I have to take a drink of water. Um, so this is a really important piece to talk about. Um, so how do we help men and boys heal? So we create a safe place to tell their story, um, which means it can be with one-on-one with an individual. It could be in a support group. There's many, many different ways of creating a safe place to tell their story. One of the things that I really stress also too, because I've been reached out by advocates who do sexual violence work against women, who often experience having to work with men who have experienced sexual abuse or sexual violence or rape, to be really specific. So often we need to check ourselves to see if we're okay to be able to have these conversations with men who may have experienced being raped or sexually abused. Um, we have to check ourselves if we can have these conversations and be okay with it. So I had one experience of an advocate calling me who had a male who was perpetrated by another male, both adults, and she was going to be meeting with this individual, and she couldn't understand why she was uncomfortable. And so we had a conversation, and by the end of our conversation, she knew that she needed to work on it because she discovered that she had her own biases. So often we need to have those conversations as advocates or individuals who are working with the male population who've been impacted by sexual violence. So it's really good to have those conversations. Compassion. One of the things that I talk about when it comes to compassion, something that I was taught was by a two-spirit Dakota woman who said, if you don't have compassion, you have nothing at all. So really understanding, having compassion for males who've been impacted, empathy, that understanding that not only does sexual violence occur with women, but also with men. We need to really understand that. Breaking down a stigma, again, going back to what I said earlier, breaking down a stigma that it's not only gay males or two-spirit males that are impacted by sexual violence, but it's also heterosexual males. But again, for me, in doing this work, I really break down that stigma by saying, just because I define as a two-spirit male, has nothing to do with the sexual violence that I experienced. I am a male who was impacted by sexual violence. Educate and awareness, like we're doing today, having these conversations, encourage and support to discuss. Again, learning how to create a safe space for males to begin to talk about their sexual violence. One of the things that I remember when I was studying to be a mental health provider, how uncomfortable it is sometimes for individuals to ask those questions to males as a mental health provider. Have you experienced sexual abuse as a child? If you're not comfortable with asking those questions, then you're going to be very uncomfortable working with someone who experienced sexual violence. So, it's really important if we want to help men and boys heal, we need to change the way we talk and think about individuals who experienced child sexual abuse. Again, going back to what I said earlier, we need to stop trivializing. We need to call out people who do those things. We need to, name it, talk about it, in order to help men and boys heal. Not all victims of child sexual abuse become abusers. Again, we need to sort of change that talk of that most individuals who are abused will become abusers themselves, sexual abusers. Well, the reality of it is that some males do become abusers, but not all males who have been impacted by sexual abuse become abusers. So we need to say that, we need to name it, because that also prevents healing for males who've been impacted by sexual violence. Because, when we're saying that, that prevents the male from coming forward, wanting to heal from his own trauma. Sweat lodge and ceremony. One of the things that I always say is that for me, I'm happy that I got the Western way of healing, because I'm able to define, I'm able to learn, I was able to learn coping skills when I would have reminders of my own sexual abuse and other traumas that I experienced. But I'm also very happy that I was able to go into the sweat lodge and be a part of ceremony. One of the things that defines my own healing that I like to talk about was that I, struggled most of my life trying to figure out why I didn't feel like a whole person. Last September, I was able to go into a ceremony. I was given my Indian name. I was also part of a healing ceremony. I was adopted by an Indian family. And after that experience, one of the things that I talk about is that this is the first time in my life that I've ever felt like a whole person. And so I know that being a part of ceremony also helped me with healing my whole self. Granted, I do have reminders of my past, but I also have the ability to cope with when I have those reminders of my past. Support groups, talking with elders. Elders have been a huge part of my healing experience. When I choose to go into the Western way of healing by seeing a mental health provider, what I will often do is that when I do that, I will also see an elder at the same time so that I bring balance. So I'm getting both the Western way of thinking and healing, and then I'm also getting the cultural, spiritual aspect of healing. So for me, that's balance. Increased funding for tribal programs. From my understanding, in the last several years, there has been funding to create programs in tribal communities in regards to healing for men, but also the fact that a lot of programs have not applied for this funding. So, we need to encourage programs in tribal programs to apply for these grants so that they can create a healing space for men and boys. So in my research, because I've done a lot of research in regards to sexual violence against men and boys, we are 20 years behind in providing service for males who experience some form of sexual violence. In a lot of the studies that I've read, these studies have come from different countries. There is not a lot of research that's done here in the United States in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. Again, stating that there's lack of data and research. I'm grateful that we finally have some data in regards to sexual violence against Native men and boys. But again, we know that that data is not accurate either because, again, in my own experience professionally and personally, I believe that the data that we have now is much more higher. So here are some resources if you're interested in reading more about sexual violence against men and boys. I have read 95% of these books. I also attached a link to that research data that I talked about earlier if you want to see the full report. We have, I usually really like to spend time discussing this topic more intently, but because of being able to do only an hour, I go through this really quickly. But I also do trainings nationally. If anyone is interested, all my contact information is at the beginning of the presentation. So if you'd like to reach out and talk with me about maybe coming in and doing some training within your community, please reach out. So this last 9 minutes of this webinar, I want to open it up for anyone who wants to ask questions. Oh, okay. So I have a question from Alicia. I love the concept of nurturing the child in you, especially as you didn't receive that as a child. My question is, how were you able to come to that conclusion that was what you needed to heal? Well, I can give you several examples. What got me to that space of connecting with that child within was my last year of doing intensive therapy. I loved my therapist because she was able to point things out to me. But one of the things she knew of was my need and my desire to be a part of Native community in regards to culture and spirituality. So she had asked me if I would reach out to a trusted elder in my community who I can go to and have this conversation about this child within. And I met with an elder who, talked with me. And what she also did with me to end sort of that long 10 years of that healing journey was that she took me into ceremony. And one of the things that she said to me during that experience of the ceremony was, she had told me to become one with that little boy. And what she said is that, I want you to take that little boy's hand. And she said, I want you to thank him for taking care of you. Even though from all of the pain, the trauma that you experienced as a child, that child within you protected you because it allowed you to create behaviors to protect yourself, both good and bad. And so she said, I want you to acknowledge that little boy. So one of the things that I said to him was, you took care of me, and now it's my turn to take care of you. So again, that goes back to what I said earlier about when I'm acting childish, I allow myself to act childish because I grew up in a dysfunctional home where a lot of the adults around me would say to me, don't act like that. You're not, and so it prevented me from acting like a child. So again, when I find myself acting childish, I allow myself to act childish. Another experience that I talk about is that I do such heavy work that I myself experienced secondary trauma, vicarious trauma in all the work that I do nationally. And so I went to go see an elder because I found myself getting really irritated quickly with people and I didn't know why. So I went to go visit an elder, and one of the things that she said to me was, how are you nurturing that little boy? And I was like, what? She said, how are you nurturing him? She said, when you're doing this national work and talking about many different forms of violence, she said, that little boy is standing beside you with his hands over his ears. So how are you nurturing him? So one of the things that I do in my work, and if I'm attending something that may be talking about the different forms of violence, or maybe if I'm having a conversation with multiple people, what I will often do is I will pull out a coloring book, and it's not an adult coloring book, but it's a child coloring book. So what I'm doing is I'm nurturing that little boy because that little boy is hearing all these conversations about the different forms of violence. And that child, my child, was a child who experienced violence, so I'm taking care of him. So those are some of the things that I like to talk about when it comes to healing the child within. Thank you, Alicia, for asking that question. Anyone else? So again, like I said, this topic is really hard to talk about, but we need to sort of start to begin to have these conversations amongst our tribal communities. And I'm glad that it's happening. It's taking time, but again, we need to create that space for males to heal. Thank you, Jenny. You're welcome. Again, like I said, if anyone um, has any questions that they don't want to ask here, please feel free to email me. If you're looking for someone to come in and do a presentation on this topic, please reach out because I do trainings. If you want to understand more about the sexual violence that happens within Native community, Frontline, PBS Frontline came out with a documentary a couple years ago called Predator on a Reservation. I would encourage you all to take a look at that documentary and really understand, you know, what I've been talking about. It's a very powerful documentary. It'll make you angry. If someone can please put that in the chat box, but go to PBS Frontline, uh, go to their documentary section, and then look for Predator on the Reservation. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I will end my part. Thank you, Alicia.
All right. Thank you, Lenny.
Yes, you
Before
all
we end
stay
this,
safe and well.
before we end the session, I'm just putting in a link into the chat. So that is a survey for this webinar. We'd love to hear what you thought, and if you're able to fill it out, we'd very much appreciate it. I want to inform everyone that we are currently rescheduling the webinar on June 22nd. We'll be sending out a newsletter when that's happened, but we don't expect it to be for at least a few months. That being said, I would like to thank Lenny, our presenter, and I'd also like to thank Daniel, the TATA host. And I would also like to thank all of you for joining us. If you aren't able to get to the survey, don't worry. We'll be sending it out in a email as soon as we have the link or the list of people who have registered. So if you aren't able to click on that, do not worry. But